Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. Before we get into today's conversation with Leslie Kean, let's hear a story from Talia from Kansas City about watching TV with the spirit of a recently departed friend.
So my best friend was killed in an attempted robbery back in 2008. And in the 2 or so years leading up to that, we lived really close to each other and were on similar schedules, so we hung out pretty much every day. And so she would come over in the evening with a 6-pack. I'd roll a couple of joints, and we'd be watching all those ghost hunter shows that were really popular at the time, usually, and some other stuff, but it was never her choice. I never let her play couch commando. I was a total dick. I always had the remote, and it was definitely a point of contention. So when she died, obviously my whole world was totally different. And for a couple of months after, I would be at home in the evenings, TV would be on. And sometimes I was watching, sometimes it was just on, because it was hard to be alone after not being alone most of the time. So, but what would happen is it would be on, and then suddenly the channels would start to change. And usually it would change to a ghost hunting show or one of the other shows that I wouldn't agree to watch with her. And of course, I don't believe in the afterlife. Half the reason why I loved the ghost hunting shows was that I felt like it proved that it was bullshit. So when this started happening, I was like, okay, well, there's got to be some kind of short somewhere. There's a glitch in the cable. There's a neighbor who's got a remote control that's the same, or there's got to be an explanation. And so I came up with all of these possibilities and tried to recreate it so many times. And I couldn't recreate it, but it kept occurring. And it was often. It wasn't every day, but it was every couple of days, every few days. And after a while, and since I didn't really believe it was her, typically I started getting really irritated with it. But one day I was feeling really raw, and I just shouted, "God damn it, Devin, quit changing these fucking channels." And it stopped, and it never happened again. And that incident alone completely changed my total unwillingness to believe that there is a possibility of something after we die, into a belief that there's got to be something. Energy can't be created or destroyed, right? So where does it go?
Somehow, American society has itself spiritually stuck between a rock and a hard place. It would seem that if you were to call yourself an atheist, which is very popular these days, then it would only be natural to assume that you also didn't believe in an afterlife or any sort of existence outside of the physical realm. Materialist reductionists have gotten so used to associating the concept of life after death with some sort of religious implication of heavens or hells that they don't even dare to ponder on the possibility of life beyond the physical realm outside of any religious cosmology and independent of any brain function. Yet, There are countless stories of medical patients that have died for several minutes, and while they had no brain activity, they reported being in the room where their body was and looking down at the doctors and nurses trying to revive it. This has even happened to blind patients. Stories like this are hard to deny. It seems to indicate that the self can exist independently of the physical body, much less the brain. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. Today's guest, Leslie Kean, has written an excellent book, Surviving Death. A journalist investigates evidence for an afterlife about just these sorts of things. It's filled with compelling anecdotes that leave little room to imagine that absolutely nothing happens after our physical bodies die. I start off the conversation by asking her what made her want to research this stuff.
Well, that's an interesting question because, as you probably know that I've spent a lot of years focused on the UFO issue. And as an investigative reporter, I was covering UFOs, and then I wrote a book on it in 2010. And all during those years, it was about 10 years before my book came out, which was now 10 years ago, I had been really interested in this topic. And even in the background, I was sort of poking around and looking into various things. And I helped some colleagues who were making a movie about the survival past death. And I went to a conference, and I just sort of was on the peripheral of it, but didn't really know that much about it. So once my UFO book came out, and then there was a year or two after that in which there was a History Channel special made based on the book. And there's all this stuff that happens because the book was really successful, and so after a couple of years after, it was around 2012, I started to feel like, this was the topic I wanted to do next. And it really connects with UFOs in the sense that it's a major mystery, and it's the two questions, are we alone in the universe and what happens when we die are like big questions.
For sure.
And big mysteries. And those are the kinds of things I'm interested in. They really pique my curiosity. And so this was sort of a natural next topic. And there was a really interesting synchronicity because I decided that I was going to make a pitch to my publisher to do a book on this topic. And I had wrote notes up about it and thought through how it might be structured and stuff. And then the very week that I was going to make that pitch, the publisher called my agent and invited me to do another book. Said, what topic would she like to do? And when my agent told them, within 5 minutes, they were like, yes.
Oh, that's great.
And it was really nice. So I was, I had to work up a proposal and all that, but it was much simpler than I had to do the first time. And then I jumped into this. And it was interesting because this book was really a personal journey for me because I didn't know. I mean, I knew what topics I would cover when I started out, but I thought it would be primarily a research book. And I was, deciding as I went along what would be included and what wouldn't, and doing a lot of research. Whereas with the UFO book, I had done the research over 10 years and everything I needed was already done. I just had to put it in the book. This book, I was learning as I went along, and all these things happened that I didn't expect would happen that ended up being part of the book. So it was very different than the first one because it was a journey, and it was way more personal for me and also much more difficult to write than the first book. But that's how it all got started. And also I had lost a very close friend of mine in 2011, a year after my UFO book came out. His name was Bud Hopkins, and he was a UFO researcher. And being with him at the moment he died was also a very provocative experience for me, and very mind-blowing just to witness somebody die. It really, just kind of helped stimulate me to want to understand what that was all about. You just can't quite comprehend it. I mean, for people who have had the experience, they understand, but I didn't know what, that I would have. It was just this feeling of it. It was almost surreal. You just can't understand how someone can be there 1 minute and gone the next, and what happens to them. And so that was sort of also something that really stimulated me to kind of want to move more into this topic.
Mm-hmm. And our culture at large seems to have that we would like to keep a comfortable arm's length between the living and the dead. It seems like it's not something that's very much a part of our day-to-day culture. Whereas if you
Right.
walk down the street in India or something and you see them burning bodies by the Ganges, like, death is much more something that they're in touch with. With here, it's kind of cloistered off into a back room somewhere at a wake.
It's true, and people don't really like to discuss it. And they
Yes.
have all kinds of euphemisms to use when they want to talk about it. And no, you're absolutely right. And I think so that too, but I think the purpose of the book was really to kind of open people's minds to the fact that death might not be the end, and maybe that'll make it easier for people to talk about it more. I don't
Sure.
know.
Sure. I can't help but think that it would. Well, what
Yeah, you might be right.
importance does psi have in regards to this extended consciousness research?
Well, that's a really interesting question because, of course, psi, which basically means, abilities that human beings have to perceive things beyond their five senses. So that would include things like clairvoyance and telepathy, which is mind-to-mind communication, or psychokinesics, which is the movement of objects by the mind, and seeing into the future, precognition, all those kinds of capabilities. Um, Human beings have those capabilities, and some human beings have developed them very, very highly, and they're like, it's like anybody who develops any kind of ability really highly, like a musician, like the best pianist in the world or something. You can have also somebody who's developed these abilities. So these kinds of abilities are useful in terms of making that connection to whatever this other dimension might be, because that is a capacity that takes you, it shows you that the physical brain is not the limitation of the mind, because
Exactly.
you can experience your mind going beyond your brain and doing things that science says it can't do because it's generated by the brain, which I don't believe it is. So that's one really important aspect of it, is just in terms of this topic, is that it allows you more access to that other world. But the other role that it plays is there's a lot of discussion and debate about whether some of the things that happen that people say or think are proof. They might use proof. I wouldn't use the word, but things that happen that people might think or assume are communications with another world, say, or communications from deceased loved ones. Some people will argue, well, maybe that's not what they are. Maybe they are simply the psi of a human being that's
Yes.
involved. And we can talk about that more when we talk about mediumship.
Sure.
Is something being perceived by a human being's very advanced psychic abilities that they don't even know they have? Or are these things coming from the afterlife or coming from a deceased person, which is what most people think. It's what the mediums think, but you can't prove it one way or the other. So there's always this debate about, what they call living agent psi versus survival psi, or versus, the psi of the human being versus the psi of the deceased person, and how do they interact? And so that's a really big question, and a good question. And we'll sort of probably, as we go through various topics, I'm sure we'll get more of a sense of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the book starts off, there's different parts to it, and it starts off with uh, tales, that sounds fictional, but stories
Yeah.
of children who are remembering their past lives. Their past lives are sort of bleeding over into their current incarnation. What are some of the important elements that researchers examine when they're looking into cases like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of important elements, and these are, I find these cases to be among the strongest evidence we have for life after death, personally. But what's important about them is that these children are very, very young, and they haven't been exposed to the things that they are talking about. So, what researchers are looking for, first of all, when they investigate the cases, is that they need specific stuff. They need the child to give them enough specific information, so that they can then go and find the person that they were before. Which obviously that person is dead, but they can find records for that person and then contact that person's family. So, if there's enough specific information, they can do that. And those are the cases that really mean something, because you have actual verification of what the child has said is accurate to some other life. Then you can do things like take the child to meet the family, the previous family, show the child objects from his previous life, ask him certain questions that only the family could know the answers to, and it's just a way of further testing the veracity of it. The other important thing that researchers look for is that all of this is a really important consideration, that whatever the child is saying needs to be recorded in some form before they begin searching for the previous, what they call the previous personality, which was the person they were in their past life. All of this stuff has to be on the record. If it's not, then you have no way of knowing whether maybe when the parents figured out who the previous person was, maybe they kind of fudged a little bit of what the child said, that kind of thing. So to make it rigorous, it's you want to have it recorded ideally through an outside investigator. But if the parents are the ones involved with it and they have a way of documenting that they made a record of the statements at a certain time, like sending them through an email to somebody or something, then you have a whole record, a case record. Then you try to find that previous person, and if the things match up, it's amazing, and you can. And there's also emotional, so just so many things that go on in these cases. But in terms of what investigators look for, which was your question, I think those are the main things, the specificity of the child's information, and then the fact that it be recorded before they find out who it was, and then the ability to find out who it was so that they can verify it. Those are the key things, yeah.
Well, could you maybe, as an example, maybe summarize like one of the most compelling cases that you researched? Maybe just to give an example.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. There's two in my book. There's one, the James Leininger case, and then there's the Ryan Hammond's case. I don't know. Do you have a preference? Should we talk about Leininger?
Well, let's do Ryan. Yeah, he's got a lot of. There's a lot of verification going on there.
Yeah, Ryan Hammond's, because a lot of people know about James Leininger. You can go to YouTube and there's some videos about his case, and it's really, really fascinating. Ryan Hammond's is a case that's not known as well. And what was unusual about Ryan Hammond's case was he started to have all these memories of he was a little boy in Oklahoma, and I think he was, he's right. Today he's about 16 years old, so I actually just saw him again last fall. So cool. He was born in 2000, in the year 2004, and in America, which is also very unusual because we don't have that many great cases in America because the culture doesn't really support this.
Yes.
But his memories were so overwhelming, and there were so many of them that this case really stands out. And so his mom was dealing with the fact that her child kept saying he lived in Hollywood, and he gave all these specific details about his life in Hollywood. And what happened was that she went and it was very troubling. He was having nightmares. It's very troubling for the parents when these things happen. So crying for his previous mom, that's kind of a hard thing on a mother. So she went and got some books about Hollywood out of the library because it just sort of seemed to calm him down. They would flip through these books and they'd look at pictures of Hollywood stuff. And there was one book she had where he was about 4.5 or 5 when this happened, pointed to a photograph and said, "Mommy, you found me. That's me. That's me." And that's, I forget the other name. Anyway, it was a still from a movie. And it had no caption or anything under it. He pointed to a person in that picture and said that was him, pointed to another person in the picture who was an actor, a famous actor, and said what that person's name was. I'm blanking out what it was. But they had at that point, they had a photograph of who he said he was. And what the other really important component of this case is his mom, whose name was Cindy, started reaching out to quite early on to the Department of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, which is where Ian Stevenson used to work, who was the pioneer in studying all these cases. And his successor is a child psychiatrist by the name of Jim Tucker. She started sending him emails at the very beginning. About every time Ryan came up with something, she sent an email to Jim Tucker. So he had on file every memory that before they had any idea if they would even ever find the previous person.
Sure. Sure.
So that's an important component of it, that it was all on the record. And when he pointed to that person in the book, it was like finally a clue. I don't think they would have ever been able to find out who the person was otherwise. It just, because Ryan had a lot of memories, but they weren't all that super specific. He didn't have like specific names or specific places, but he had zillions of memories about his life. He did remember that his street had the word rock or mount in it, but that's still not good enough. It's not a specific street. So with this photograph, they had something to go on, and eventually what happened was Jim Tucker helped find and provide resources for them to get this. The problem was the guy in the photograph was, they got the movie and they looked at it. It was a movie made in 1932. And Ryan remembered all these things about making that movie, which was astonishing. Like saying there's a closet full of guns in the movie, Mom. And then they got the movie and there was this closet full of guns in it. And he remembered, all these kinds of very specific things. And but the person in the photograph that he pointed to was an extra in that movie. He literally had not one line in the movie. And they assumed that his name wasn't listed in the credits. There was nothing they could find online to figure out who he was. So they eventually had to hire this major film archive library in Los Angeles, where it was just this huge archive where all these old movies, documents and a lot of old movies were stored. And they hired this archivist there, and the archivist was eventually able to find a photograph of that particular extra with the name on the back of the picture.
Cool.
And at that moment, they had their guy. His name was Marty Martin. And from that point on, they were able to do all this research into Marty Martin, and they figured out that everything, all these memories that Ryan had said were completely accurate. And there were actually 55 memories that were accurate, which is extraordinary. There usually aren't that many. They ended up going back also and finding Marty Martin's daughter from the previous life. Marty Martin died in, I think it was 1964. So his daughter, when he died, was 8 years old. And so it was very weird. They took Ryan to meet who would have been his daughter in his previous life, who was 8 when he died in his previous life. And now she was in her 60s.
Wow.
Yeah, so this little boy, he wanted to go to Hollywood. He was desperate to go to Hollywood, and there was this film company that wanted to do a documentary, so they were willing to pay for the whole trip. But he was very freaked out by it, and he wouldn't even talk to her. And he just sort of sat outside the door while the film people talked to her and stuff. She didn't want to go in camera and all that. So it's a very emotionally troubling situation when this happens. But that was an amazing case because there were so many memories. Like he said his house was on Roxbury Drive, and he had said it was either a street with a rock or mount in it. And all these things about how many kids he had, and he had one daughter, and the kinds of pets they have. He had a big swimming pool. He used to go to Europe all the time and travel. He liked to go to Chinatown. I mean, all these things, and some of them more specific than others. Some of them are very specific. But anyway, so that's that case. And then what usually happens is once the child is able to reconnect with the previous family, there's something that kind of cathartic that happens, and they're able to move on. So with Ryan, it involved going back to the location of his old house. And meeting his previous daughter didn't help. But going back to the location and just, and he also went back to the place where he worked in the previous life. So one of the things he used to say in his memory bank, before they had any idea who he was before, was that he was an agent. He kept saying, I was an agent, and I used to change people's names. We had to change our names. And Jim Tucker and his mom thought he was talking about some kind of CIA agent or something, and they thought he probably was just making that up. It didn't make any sense to them. But he kept talking about he wanted to wear agent clothes. And when he was an agent, he would wear sunglasses. And so it turned out, they found out that Marty Martin ran a talent agency in Hollywood. And
interesting.
And that involved changing people's names because he had all these celebrities with these phony names. And so one of the things Ryan did was when he went back out there to Hollywood, he went back to the building where the agency was. And he was able to, they arranged for him to go in the building. He was able to walk around. It was exactly the same. And he was so happy to be back in that building. For some reason, there's these photographs of him just ecstatic in that building, showing his parents around and everything. And then somehow that freed him up emotionally, and he was able to just go on and be a normal kid after that and sort of let these things recede, which usually the children forget the memories at the age of around 5 or 6 anyway. Ryan was a little older because he had speech problems, so he couldn't talk earlier on, or he would have been talking about this at a younger age. But anyway, so that's sort of the story. And in my book, I give more detail about what the memories were and all this kind of stuff. But very unusual for a child to see himself in a photograph.
Yeah.
Very, very unusual. And as I said, if that hadn't happened, they probably never would have figured out who he was.
Exactly. Who knows how
Yeah.
many situations like that happen where the person was just like a farmhand or something, and there's no documentation of their existence whatsoever, except, unless somebody kept a journal or a diary or something way back when. So who knows how many
Right.
cases happen and they just kind of go unnoticed, or the parents roll their eyes or just assume that their kid is just dreaming up something and they just move on, it's
All the time,
amazing.
I'm sure, especially in cultures like ours where we don't support it. I mean, in Asian countries, people, there's a lot more acceptance of it, and that's where Ian Stevenson's cases mainly were in Asian countries, when he spent decades documenting these things. And sometimes these kids in India would remember a life where they died 2 years ago, and they'd remember so much that they could just go to the next town and find the family.
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
but you're right. In America, I think a lot of times children they won't remember enough to ever be able to trace it. It's only when you have enough specifics that you can ever get there. And also with these children, there's a lot of emotional issues that go around. They often have nightmares. Both Ryan and James Leininger had horrible nightmares, kind of reliving. With James, it was reliving a very terrifying death. And then they'll also play act things from the previous life. Like Ryan used to pretend he was a film director when he was really young. He would go to birthday parties and he'd try to direct all the kids because he had been involved with movies as in the previous life, and everybody thought it was very cute but kind of strange.
Yeah,
you
sure.
know. So there's a lot of play acting, and they also have knowledge of things, like about movies, in his case, or of things they couldn't possibly have gotten in this life. So there's a lot of elements that go into it. Anyway.
And
Yeah.
one of the fathers, I don't remember whether it was James's father or Ryan's, was really resistant to the idea. Not only was reincarnation not a part of their spirituality, but he was against it, right?
Exactly. That was James's case. His father just resisted the whole time, but he was the one doing the investigation because his motivation was to prove that his son was not accurate.
Right. Yeah.
He spent years digging into it, years and years, and it was just extraordinary, and it completely transformed him when he finally realized that, and was able actually to find who the person was that his child had been in the past. It
Interesting.
completely transformed him, and he realized that it was not in conflict with his Christian religion. He was able to find a way to feel that they were not in conflict. So that was a whole journey. And when I was writing the book, I talked a lot to James Leininger's dad, and I actually had him write some little sections that I included in the chapter, so that part of the story of the case involves the transformation that his father went through. So I think you're right. I think it's hard for people with religions. There's a whole lot of reasons that people resist. And in Ryan's case, his dad was a police officer, and he at first resisted this, but then he didn't like that it was happening, and he kind of resisted it. But then he realized that his child wasn't lying. I mean, he said, I know I can look in someone's eyes as a police officer. I can tell when someone's lying and he's not lying. And so he wasn't as involved as the mom, but he accepted it, I think, a lot more easily than James's dad did.
And in some of these cases, too, sometimes the children will have some sort of a physical attribute that correlates with the way that they died in their previous life, too, right?
That is so fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, there are cases where there will be a birthmark, say. So if you know anyone that has a birthmark, it's not so bad. It might just be from your past life,
Absolutely.
But where they'll have a birthmark, and then they'll remember this is one case, being shot by a gun. I think there's one case the child was on his bike as an adult, and he was shot in the back of the head. And so there's this mark on the back of his head, and there's another mark in the front of his head. And it turned out that the child was the previous person was shot in the back of the head, and the bullet came out the front. And they were able to get the autopsy report from the previous person, so they could prove that. And the child had these 2 marks right in the part of the head where he had been shot in the previous life. I mean, that's so fascinating. And there are other cases too where they're either birthmarks or birth defects that correspond to things from the previous life. There's another child who had was born without all the fingers. I have some pictures in my book. Fingers missing from one hand. And he remembered being his hand being caught in some kind of farm device, a foddering machine, some machine that took off all his fingers. I mean, some of them I don't know if you could actually prove if they ever actually found the previous person. I don't know, but there were other cases where they did find autopsy reports or members of previous families who could confirm that these birthmarks related to things. It's so fascinating to just try to contemplate what is going on there. Why would it carry through on the physical body like that?
Exactly. It's almost like it imprinted on their, whatever you want to call it, their soul or whatever it is that goes from body to body. Like somehow that genetic blueprint jumped with the consciousness. That's just so compelling to me.
It is. It shows that it's more than just genetics, I guess, that creates a person, because that obviously was something not in their genetics, but it still showed up on their physical body. So I guess it shows that the mind is more powerful than we think.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely the case. Yeah. In the case of, for instance, Tibetan Buddhism, they have where they believe that people in between lives spend time in the bardo, and they have a very specific time period of 49 days that you reside there until you choose your next body if you're going to be reincarnated. Did you ever run into anything like that? It seems like these cases are all very varied, like some of their previous lives are a long time ago.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, Chris, that these 2 cases, which I write about in my book, and the reason I do is because they're very strong cases, and they're American cases, and they're recent. So that's why I focused on them. But there are so you were asking me about time periods, right? And about because that they were so long. But there are many, many cases on the record at the University of Virginia in their database, which the time period is much shorter. And these were unusually long, both of them.
Gotcha.
So I would say it's more, I mean, I'm sure they have a statistic on what the average amount of time is, but it's probably more like something between 2 and 4 years or something like that. These were, as I said, not the typical time periods. They're usually shorter. But I assume that, but again, so many of their cases are not American cases. But yeah, that's a good point. But I've never heard of anything exact like 49 days,
The Tibetan Buddhists really have it down to a science. I mean, it's really amazing how much detail they have. I mean, the whole Tibetan Book of the Dead is nothing but details of what happens right after you die. Very interesting stuff.
I wonder how so does anybody ever wait longer than 49 days before they Is it either 49 days or never, or can you wait and do it later?
I don't know. I don't know if they offer any other options. I think that they just say, this is what happens. This is what's going to happen to you. Don't go towards the green light. Go towards the white light. You're going to see this, but don't go towards that. Go towards this thing. It's very detailed. Yeah, it is very, very.
Well, maybe they would believe that these lives of James and Ryan's, maybe they would argue that there could have been a life in between them or something.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Yeah, something very short.
It doesn't seem that way, because these especially James, who was killed in a plane, his plane was shot down in World War II. I mean, the death was so traumatic that one argument that people make is that, and it's interesting because the majority of children who remember their previous lives are children that whose previous death was traumatic like that.
Sure.
I think it's like something like 75% of them or something like that either died unnatural deaths, either through murder or an accident like that, or drowning or something. And they were usually younger than young people who just had this horrible traumatic death. And so one might think that one of the reasons that it's still that they remember it, that it's still simmering in their soul when they're born again, is that because of the nature of that death, that they hadn't finished that life yet.
Sure.
And so
Sure.
there's something that carries over for them. So it's sort of hard to imagine that there was some life in between for these two, for somebody like James Leininger. Of course, I don't know anything. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, so I don't know. I guess different spiritual traditions have different ways of framing all of this and seeing it, and they're all different. But the essential message is that life continues on after death. I guess that's the uniform principle in all religions.
Sure. Well, I mean, and I don't know about other religions. I mainly researched Tibetan Buddhism, but you can be reincarnated as an animal or as a god or a goddess, or it's not just humans, human to human. So it would be interesting. You never hear any stories about somebody who remembers being a dog.
There's one case that Jim Tucker has, you might find, where I think a child remembers being a snake.
Oh,
I'm serious.
crazy.
Yeah, after if you want, I'll email you the title of the book. You might find it really interesting.
Cool.
I mean, of course, there's nothing they could ever prove.
Of course.
But the child really had that memory.
Interesting. Yeah. I've never heard of that.
I think that's the only animal one that I remember hearing about also.
Huh. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, the next part of your book deals with near-death experiences, which also is a very compelling topic to me too. How did you set about researching that? Did you just start collecting stories, or?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of knew, and I actually didn't spend a lot of time on this topic in my book because I think so many people know a lot about it. So I tried to bring in information that was maybe not as well known. And I started off by looking at what we call veridical OBEs. Veridical means provable or evidential experiences of people leaving their bodies when they're essentially clinically dead, and then being able to report when they wake up things that they experienced that can be verified. And that's not a near-death experience, but it's often a precursor to a near-death experience. And in some ways, it's more evidential of the fact that consciousness can function separately from the brain. That's really the purpose of this particular realm of investigation, is, can consciousness function independently of the brain? Well, these veridical OBEs are, a way of really proving that it does, because the person has no brain function, and yet they're able to leave their bodies and observe, hear things in the operating room, or go down the hallway and see something, listen to what the doctors are saying, we'll look at the tools that are being used, all these things, and then report back later that that's what they saw, and that can be verified. And so that's real evidence for the fact that, and they're often from a perspective like the ceiling, whereas if they were even awake, which skeptics like to think somehow they wake up under anesthesia or something, they still couldn't see things from that perspective. So they wouldn't see certain tools if they were lying down, So it's very, very good evidence for the fact that consciousness is not just a manifestation of the brain, because it seems to be active when the brain has no function, is basically dead. There's no heartbeat. So from there, you can sometimes people will go off into the afterlife, and have what we call near-death experiences, and they're absolutely incredible, but they're not provable in the same way that a veridical OBE is. But nonetheless, they're tremendous evidence for the survival of consciousness, because these people, and for the research on that, I mean, I looked at statistical studies that have been done, with massive numbers of interviews being done in hospices and hospitals, and seeing how many people had these experiences and stuff like that. But I think most interesting are the actual stories that people have, and trying to find the ones that are the most evidential. Like sometimes a person will maybe meet someone in their near-death experience who they didn't even know had died.
Yeah.
Something like that. So when they have those experiences, they're actually leaving this world and going into an afterlife world, and they'll they'll meet relatives and friends who have already died, and they'll often see some kind of a being of light, and they sometimes have conversations over there, and then they realize they have to go back because they have certain things they have to do. There's a lot of consistencies among the stories all over the world for over long periods of time, which I find very interesting. And these experiences change somebody's life so dramatically that that sort of helps point to the reality of them. Plus, the people say that they're more vivid and more real than anything they've ever experienced here in the physical world. That they would say those are more real than this.
It's like they don't have to go through the interface of their physical body, so they're accessing quote unquote reality from a whole different set of uh, receivers, stimulus receivers, you know? We don't have to go
Right.
through our nose and our eyes and our ears when we're
How
out of our body.
liberating, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And
And
they, you know, they feel that they're in the place where you go when you die. And
yeah,
that's what they're told. And so
sure.
now they know with a capital K, without any doubt, that we survive death. They are
Yes.
no longer afraid of death, and it stays with them for the rest of their lives. It just really has a profound effect. And I think people who investigate these things believe that if it was just some kind of dream or hallucination, it wouldn't have that big an effect. And there wouldn't be the consistency that there is. But when the brain is not functioning, you're not going to have hallucinations anyway. There's no brain capability there to do anything when these things are happening.
Yeah.
So it's a really, really incredible thing.
Well, I think it's really compelling too when you have a case of somebody who in their physical body couldn't see. They were blind. And then they leave their body and then they can see. Like
Isn't
that's
that phenomenal? I
that's
mean,
insane.
that is really insane. This one case, what was the name of the woman? I forget her name, who I write about in my book, um, who, describes she was blind from birth. And she was so confused by it. She didn't even like it. It just freaked her out to
Yeah.
suddenly be able to see her own body. And she describes in my book, I have these little sections that that came from interviews with her. She's no longer living, but describing how she saw a ring on her finger on her body below. That's how she knew it was her. And just it was frightening to her and freaky.
I'm sure.
But she was actually could somehow see even though she didn't have a body.
That's amazing.
Just try to figure that out.
Yeah.
And then it's just really a lot of amazing things happen in this world.
You can't fake that. There's no faking that. That's there's
Exactly.
and I think a compelling story too that you tell in the book is about the shoe on the ledge. Maybe if you could summarize that, that's pretty
Yeah.
compelling too.
I mean, that's an extraordinary, well-documented case of a veridical OBE of somebody leaving their bodies. So in this hospital, it was in Seattle. I think it was in the 1970s or something like that. This woman named Maria had cardiac arrest. She was completely unconscious. They were trying to revive her. And doing all the things they do to resuscitate somebody. And when she finally came back, she told the social worker who was with her, whose name was Kimberly, who actually wrote the chapter in my book. She tells the story herself. I invited about 10 other people to write chapters in this book themselves, so you get to hear directly from them. So she tells the story of how this woman Maria woke up and said she had seen this tennis shoe outside a window ledge in the hospital when she was out of her body. She had gone outside the building and there was this shoe sitting out there. And it made no sense to Kimberly. She thought, this is ridiculous. And the woman just was so emotional, Maria, and just so insistent that please go find that shoe. She wanted to prove it, that she had seen it. And she described what the shoe looked like. She said that one of the laces was tucked underneath it and it had a scuff mark in a certain place and, things like that. So Kimberly was like, oh, all right, it seems to mean an awful lot to her. And this was a massive facility. I have a picture of it in my book, a huge place. And so she couldn't go outside and walk around it. I think there was just no sidewalk or something. So she had to go through every room in the hospital and look out the window. And so she kind of went floor by floor, and she finally found that shoe. And like on in one particular floor, she opened, there it was. And it was exactly as Maria had described it, with the scuff mark in the certain place, the shoelace as she described it. And what was interesting, though, this is a little detail. I love these kinds of little details that really interested me. She described that there was a scuff mark. I think it was over where one of the toes would have been. I don't remember if it was the big toe or the small toe, but there was a scuff mark there. And what Kimberly noticed when she opened the window to see the shoe was that that scuff mark wasn't visible except unless you were outside the window.
Wow.
Isn't that awesome? So
That
it's
is
not
incredible.
like she could look through the window and see it because it was the side facing out.
Wow.
You couldn't even see it by looking down on it. It was on the side of the shoe. And so here was a detail the woman was able to provide where you had to be outside the window in the air to see it. You know? I like that. I love details like that.
Yes.
And so that shoe became a kind of a holy, an icon or something in that hospital.
An
All the
artifact.
staff were coming around to see it. Everyone was talking about it, yeah. But that is just such a beautiful example of evidence that this person was not in their body.
That's amazing.
Because they were able to find that shoe. And she saw, Maria had a lot of other experiences, which they also were able to verify when she was out of her body, other things she saw, but this was the most striking one. Yeah.
Well, so do you think it would be accurate to say that what happens during an NDE would be more of a change of frequency rather than going to a place like, heaven or something like that? You think it's more like you just change your vibration a little bit, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I mean, it depends whether you're talking about an out-of-body experience or an NDE, which are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
Like the shoe on the ledge story was not an NDE, if you want to make that distinction.
Sure.
Because she was just out of her body and then she came back. But she didn't go off into the afterlife, which is what you do in an NDE.
You're right, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know which I think, with the out-of-body experience, I mean, I have no way of knowing what's going on in terms of vibrations or the energy of the person. I mean, I have no way of explaining the mechanism by which that works. I'm sure there are other people that study or that are, it's more of a metaphysical question or something. I don't know. I can't possibly try to explain it. All I can do is sort of report on the fact that it happens. And, the experiencers can try to describe what it feels like. That's probably our best way of getting some kind of a glimpse into what's happening there energetically. But as a journalist, it's just impossible to know those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, and this would seem to dispel any sort of connection between biology and consciousness, because this would seem to prove that the biology doesn't need to be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are many of these cases. Basically, I'm happy to use the word proof there, although I guess there would be some people who might take issue even with that, but that being proof, but that the consciousness of a person is not dependent on the physical brain, and therefore the consciousness can function separately of that brain. I mean, you can see, smell, observe things, you can have thoughts and feelings without a brain, is sort of what it's saying.
Sure.
And that's very close to saying, well, if it happens when we're clinically dead, does the same thing happen when we really die, And it's sort of, you can't prove that it does, but it's very suggestive that this is certainly a strong possibility that this might happen when we die at the end too. That's what's important about it. But there are some people, I think the people we were talking earlier about the psi argument, they might make the argument that there was some kind of I think, like I have many discussions throughout my book with Stephen Browdy, who's a philosopher who I respect very, very highly, who wrote a fantastic book about the after, called Immortal Remains, about evidence for the afterlife. And he's basically very strong on the psi hypothesis. So he might argue that Maria, the patient, was having some kind of clairvoyant, he had a clairvoyant ability to somehow see that shoe there. But it didn't necessarily mean she actually left her body. She might have felt that she had left her body, but maybe it was some kind of a dream where her clairvoyance was involved. And so she was able to see. Clairvoyance is like seeing at a distance,
Sure.
And so, I mean, somebody could make that argument that maybe that's what was going on. Of course, Maria didn't experience it. She experienced herself as out of her body. And that's how she described it. So, again, there's never any proof really, but I think I tend to put a lot of trust in what the experiencers tell me.
Absolutely.
And I think especially if they're all saying the same kinds of things, they should be the ones to know better than anybody else what's going on.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah, I think that we've gotten too proof reliant in sort of the way that science is practiced these days. And I understand. I mean, that's kind of the only way scientifically you can verify things is by being able to reproduce it, being able to measure it and quantify it and stuff like that. But I think that sometimes takes the emphasis or the importance off of firsthand experience. And I think if you have, dozens, hundreds, thousands of firsthand experiences that have so much overlap, that should be paid attention to. I think there's something there for sure.
I completely agree with you. And a lot of these experiences, you can't reproduce them, even if you wanted to. You can't,
of course,
make someone almost die so that you can do a test on whether they have an out-of-body experience. I mean, there's no way to do it that way.
Absolutely.
So you just have to study a case after case after case after case. And then, like you just said, you see all these similarities, and that really means something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, too, that some people, obviously, judging by the stories that we've told here and all the overlap and evidence, that there are people that reincarnate. But other people report when they pass over or when they start to pass over, have a NDE or an ELE, which we'll get into, that they meet people that are, that have passed before them that obviously have not reincarnated. They're still there in their same form that they were when they were living. That's interesting to me, that it seems like it's so easy for us to want to say that, well, this is evidence for what happens after life. But maybe there's lots of different options that happen after life. Maybe some people do reincarnate. Some people hang around in the middle place. I just find that compelling, right? That there seems to be a lot of different things going on, and we always try and pinpoint it as to this thing is happening and that thing isn't happening, but maybe it's all happening.
I agree with you, Chris. I don't feel like it can be pinpointed at all, and there's, I mean, I've had, been in with mediums, what we can talk about later, where sometimes they don't even, some have never seen any reincarnations, or other people, some people who might be people that you might trust will say, I don't really think reincarnations happen. And other people will say, oh, they happen all the time. And I mean, there is no way to pinpoint it. I totally agree with you. All we can do is just look at the cases that we have, look at what we have, keep exploring it. And it may be that there's no way to pin anything down, and that's just the nature of what we're dealing with.
Sure, exactly. And I don't know why we should think of the afterlife as something different than this life, because, I mean, it's pretty obvious if you just look around. People are having all different kinds of experiences in this life. Some people are having a great life. Some people are having a horrible life. Sometimes that's from their own making. Sometimes it's from their circumstances. Like, there's lots of different things happening. So I would assume that in the next place or in the next vibration, however you want to put it, there's lots of different things happening there too.
Exactly. And there's so much we don't understand also.
Sure.
And I don't think that's going to change much either. So, yeah, I think you're right.
So I brought up an LEE just then. What is an LEE for the people that have never heard of that before?
End of life experiences. I mean, these are, and they're interestingly sort of connected with near-death experiences too, which I find interesting. I like to try to connect things as much as I can.
Yeah.
But these are experiences that people have who are consciously dying. Like they might be in a hospice. I mean, which by that I mean they're not hooked up to a zillion machines and under intense medication or something. They're just, they might have low level, but they're in a hospice and they're aware of what's going on, and they will sometimes have experiences of, connecting to the other side and coming back, or they'll say that somebody is coming for them in the room, or they'll have visions and it seems very real to them, and it's sort of like they're beginning to make their transition, and they'll have these experiences that are sort of like little mini NDEs in some ways. because they'll describe kind of going there and coming back very briefly, or meeting deceased loved ones who are coming to help them make the transition and things like that. Yeah, I mean, my mother had such an experience. It's very common for people who are with family members who are dying to witness them having these kinds of experiences. And they seem to make the death process, much less scary, and the dying person feels they have support from that other world. And it's just a very positive thing, but it's very common. It's just so common that, and these people are not on drugs that are causing them to hallucinate. So the doctors who are around them in the hospices and the nurses, by and large, accept that these experiences are basically happening for these people, and that they have some reality and that they're helpful. They don't dismiss them as just some sort of crazy thing. So I think it's wonderful, and I've seen my mother had one, and I know so many other people who've described people that have had them. So it's just an important, and they're, yeah, and I just like the fact that they do sort of connect with other elements of experiences that people have connecting to this reality.
Is would that be the same thing in ELE as a deathbed vision?
Yeah, so that's it, it's deathbed vision. That's when, if I can remember, that's when they actually see somebody, right, coming for them.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, like I'll tell you the story of my mother. My mother had she died in her early 90s, and she had a brother whose name was Lloyd. She called him Lloydie. Nobody else called him Lloydie. And he died a few years before her, and when the night before she died, she was in hospice. She was just sleeping. And suddenly she just woke up, and she reached out her arms and said, "Lloydie," like she was saying her brother's name with a question mark, like, "Lloydie, is that you?" And then so she went, "Lloydie," and then she went, "Lloydie," like, "Lloydie, I'm so happy to see you," but you could just hear it in her voice. It was like, "Lloydie," like, "Oh my God, it's you." And her
That's
arms
great.
are outstretched, and and she just had this moment of joy. And then she went back to sleep, and she died, maybe 10 hours later or something like that.
Wow.
But that's the kind of thing. I mean, it had this sense of being so real.
Mm-hmm.
That she was actually seeing her brother, and you just didn't doubt that in that moment. So that's an example of, I guess, what we call, you had a technical term for it. I'm sure it's in my book, a deathbed vision, right?
Deathbed vision, yes.
Yeah, and these are just so common.
And
so
some of
common.
them are shared by other people in the room too, right?
You mean they have the vision at the same time?
Yeah,
Or...
they kind of see what it, like sometimes people will see like a mist rising up from the person.
Yeah,
or yeah.
That is very rare, but I know that Peter Fenwick, incredible scientist or psychiatrist, whatever, from England, wrote the chapter on ELEs in my book. And that's, to me, is just incredible. He describes seeing a white light or a kind of a mist around the person's body when they die. Some of the hospice nurses, I think those are fairly rare, but they do happen. Or they see lights in the room, little flickering lights and things like that. Extraordinary. Yeah, I mean, the people that work in the hospices are the ones who really encounter this kind of thing a lot. And, it's fascinating there's so much of the people that are providing the information for, scientists who study these things, because they're seeing it all the time. Yeah. So
yeah, that's amazing.
It's a kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And you certainly hope that you're going to have, I hope that when my times come, I'm going to have a conscious death in which I can have those kinds of experiences.
Yes.
But you don't always know what's going to happen. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So then the next part of your book sort of goes into communicating with the dead, and a lot of that has to do with mediums. So there are mediums who communicate with the discarnates, and there's a way to actually certify these mediums, right? To kind of sort of give them some legitimacy in research, for research purposes. What kind of certification process is that?
Well, there are two organizations in the United States. One is called the Winbridge Research Institute. The other is called the Forever Family Foundation. And both of them have these certification programs. I'm not sure they're still doing it now, but they spent many years testing mediums, basically. And they have these very rigorous testing protocols. I think the Windbridge ones were even more rigorous than Forever Family, where they had to go through all these different stages of, all kinds of testing and questioning, and then they would have to do readings under very, very controlled conditions, in which they'd have to show that they could indeed get accurate information in various ways. I mean, the Windbridge ones were something like, 5 times blinded. The medium was, even the sitter wasn't even there, and all this stuff to make it extremely scientific. And with Forever Family, the medium would have to do a certain number of readings, and they were short in a day, with a certain number of sitters, and have to have a certain percentage of accuracy. And it was very hard to pass these tests. I mean, most mediums who applied to both of them did not pass, maybe, I don't know, 10% or something. And so the good thing about it is that if somebody's looking for a medium, they can go to the websites of these organizations and they will find the names of the ones who have been certified. And so it's just a helpful thing, because they're, to know that these mediums have passed those tests, and I think it's a good thing that they've done it. But there are plenty of mediums out there who haven't been tested and are excellent as well. So, it's just so that's what they do. And both these organizations study mediumship, and in different ways. But Forever Family is very interested in making the point that mediumship readings can help people who are grieving, and that's basically the message that they have. And they study mediums, and they write about them, and they do events with them, and they have a weekly radio thing they do, and it's all about just the power of mental mediumship for people, and how it can, and other paranormal things, but their main focus is around that. So that's how I got, when I did my first reading, I went to the Forever Family Foundation, and I've since come to know the people who run that. There's a married couple who run that organization. They lost a daughter in a car crash when she was a teenager, so that's what motivated them to seek out mediums, and then they eventually started this organization. And so they were able to recommend someone to me that they thought was the best medium they knew. So anyway, that's how that works. And then I did my first reading with a medium, not knowing what would come of it, and I was absolutely blew my mind. It was so good. So.
Could you recount it for us, or at least
aspects
of it?
Yeah, I mean, her name was Laura Lynn Jackson. She's now has become famous. Unfortunately, she's so famous now that you can't get a reading with her. She's written 2 books, and they were New York Times bestsellers, and she's just become very well known. But when I was fortunate enough to have a reading with her before any of that happened, so and she was extraordinary, and just got so much accurate information about two people that I had lost. One of them. So one thing that happened was, while I was writing my book, my younger brother died in 2013, very suddenly and unexpectedly. And it happened during the time I was researching my book. And I was talking earlier about how this was really a journey for me. And that certainly created that aspect of it, because while I was doing all this work, my brother had died, and I was in a lot of grief, but I was also consulting mediums and hearing from him through these mediums. And then I ended up having my own direct communications with him, which is a whole separate thing. But so when I did my I did 2 very, very good mental mediumship readings, which I write about in the book. Both my brother and my friend Bud Hopkins, who died in 2011, came through these readings. And I had no idea what to expect, Chris. I mean, I had never had a reading before. I was skeptical, absolutely no idea what would happen, and it was just shocking to me how accurate they were, and how much it felt like these 2 people were actually there, because It wasn't just the information that came through, it was also their personalities, their manner, their style of communications. The 2 people that were close to me were absolute opposites in terms of their personalities, and that came through. It wasn't just what they said, it was the way they said it and how they manifested themselves. So it was just really a life-changing, and I do. And in the book, I go into a lot of the specifics of what they said and showed how they were accurate and everything. But it just was so transformative for me, and it really did help me in my grief process, I have to say, for my brother. And then I had another reading a couple of months later with a different medium. This one was an Irish medium. Her name is Sandra O'Hara. She is available for readings if anybody's interested, but very different style than Laura. And the interesting thing, I'll tell you this little experiment I did, which I never thought would ever work. But after the first reading, I said to my two people, my brother and Bud Hopkins, I meditated and asked them numerous times, when you come through for the second reading, first of all, please show up again. And second of all, please say something exactly the same that you said the first time, because then I'll know it was really you.
Sure.
And I just sent this thought out to them. And I thought, it's probably never going to happen, but why not try, So I said, please just repeat something that you said before. And so when I did the second reading, I was almost more shocked than the first one, Chris, because they did that. And what they were each repeated was the most personal thing they had said in the first reading. It was
Wow.
the one thing that nobody else could possibly know but me.
That's
so
incredible.
It wasn't just something like when they died, but it was a personal thing they referenced.
Wow.
And when Sandra said it, I just, my jaw, I just could not believe it. And I was so careful. Sandra did not know my name. She didn't know anything about me. I took out a separate email address that had no reflection on my name. She just had my first name. As far as she knew, I could have been anywhere in the world, with somebody with the first name Leslie. That's all she knew about me. And I made sure there was no way that she could find out anything. She didn't have a phone number, an email address, or anything that would link her to me. So when this kind of thing happens, your mind just sort of cracks open, and you just realize, wow, there's a lot more going on here than I ever would have imagined. That was pretty amazing. And I was very fortunate. I mean, I don't think that happens very often, but sometimes you can ask. I know people who have asked their loved one for a specific thing to happen when they go to a reading, and it sometimes happens. Like, say something about this specifically and then they will. And now a psi person can say, well, it's just telepathy. The medium is reading the mind of the sitter and knows that the sitter wants that word to come out, and so they're going to say it by reading that person's mind. But in my situation, I had nothing in mind at all that's specific for them to say. I just knew that I'd asked them that. I put it aside, and I just sat down and did the reading, and I wasn't like focusing on any specific thing for that person to say. So it was just really cool. That's all I can say. And then I did a bunch of other readings that weren't nearly as good as those two. Uh-huh. And one thing people need to realize about mental mediumship readings is they're not always going to be great. And even the best mediums can do a bad reading or have a bad day, or for whatever reason it doesn't work out. And so I encourage anybody who's interested in this to go back to that medium on a different day, or find another one, but don't become discouraged, because there's so many factors that go into creating a good reading. There's 3 elements: the sitter, the medium, and the deceased person, and they all have to line up and be in the right energetic, synchronicity at that moment for the reading to happen. And there's a lot of things that can affect it. So I would just encourage people that if it doesn't work out the first time, to go to a different medium, or just keep making that journey, and it'll eventually happen for you.
Yeah, and I didn't realize it either. I don't know why, but I'd never thought about how much responsibility a medium has when they're contacting somebody who's crossed over. Like, there's a lot of in the moment translation that has to occur when you're getting all these, because they get them in different ways. Some people get visions, some people hear voices. I mean, there's lots of ways that they make this contact, right?
That's right. And their job is, they're sort of acting like a telephone operator. They have to listen and then try to translate it for you. And like they might get an image of something, and it could mean a whole lot of different things. So I think the best thing is when the medium just tells you what the image is and lets you interpret it. And they don't necessarily know what it means. I mean, the example, one of the most incredible things I got, and I'll give you an example of that in my reading with Laura. Was it Laura or Sandra? I think it was Sandra, actually. She said she was when my friend Bud Hopkins was around, and he was a UFO investigator, and she hadn't even gotten that part yet, that he had anything to do with UFOs. She just suddenly said, "I don't know what this means. I have no idea, but I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm seeing, and you're just." And she said, "And you're going to think I'm crazy, you know." So she said, "You know the movie E.T.? There's a little boy in the movie E.T., and the ET creature, the boy's name was Elliot, and the ET creature is pointing his finger at Elliot, at the little boy, and saying, 'Elliot, Elliot,' in this weird way." She said, "I don't know why they're showing me this, but it's supposed to have some meaning for you." Well, it had incredible meaning for me, because Bud Hopkins, his focus was on abductions, which is dealing with ET creatures who affect human beings. And number two, his name was Elliot.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
His real name was Elliot. It was not Bud. That was his nickname. So it was like a double whammy in that moment. And the medium had no idea what that meant.
That's great.
But I knew exactly what it meant. And to me, that was one of the highlights of the whole reading. So yeah, the medium, now if she had tried to interpret that rather than just tell me what it was, she might have given me the wrong interpretation. And I never would have. So it can be tricky. They have to decide, when they're going to interpret things and when they're going to just give them to the, another time she was like, Sandra's really good. She doesn't interpret, she just gives it to you. Like another time she was talking about my friend Bud Hopkins's daughter, and she said, "I don't know what this means, but I'm hearing the song Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace." She said it's a reference for something. And Bud's daughter's name was Grace. So that's somehow the way the information will sometimes come through. It's like the medium will just say, "I don't know what this means, but I'm getting it, and here it is." And to you, it means everything,
Yeah, and it could be partially the whatever template they're putting on top of it too, with their own perceptions.
Right, and I think with something like, some mediums will do that more than others. Like I think with Sandra, it was just very clean. She heard that song, and she didn't try to put any meaning into it, but just told me what she was hearing. And sometimes they will get an image and they'll say something like, they might say, "Is the month of July important for you?" And then you'll say, "Well, no, it's not." And then they'll say, "How about something else?" And then they'll say, "Well, I'm getting the number 7." And often 7 will mean the month of July. So they might first try a few other things, but then they'll tell you what they're getting. It's every medium works differently. But anyway, it's a wonderful process. It's a great experience when you have a medium that really does a good job for you. And I found it to be really meaningful. And I was able to analyze as a journalist, I also want to be analytical. So I recorded the readings. I was able to step back afterwards, make lists of every single point they made, and then rate them in terms of their accuracy, and then kind of figure out a percentage of accuracy that the readings have. Because they give you stuff that's not accurate too, or they give you stuff that you don't know if it's accurate. You'll just, and the best evidence is when they give you something you think is inaccurate, and then you go to your family member 2 weeks later and you find out it was exactly accurate, but you just didn't know. Yeah. So there's all these things you can do, and then you can create a chart of accuracy for different readings that you have. If you develop a system that you can score them, that's what they do. And then when they certify the readings in these two organizations, they have ways of scoring. The sitter will score the reading. And that's one way they're able to assess the accuracy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what is, you also mentioned something called after-death communication.
Yeah.
And you've had personal experiences with that too, right?
Yeah. It's sort of a natural segue. So when you go to a medium, you are communicating or contacting your loved one with an intermediary. When you have an after-death experience, you are having that experience directly with no intermediary. So it sort of is a natural evolution that you can ask yourself, well, if my loved one is there and I'm able to communicate with that loved one through this medium, why can't I just do it directly? Why do I need someone in the middle? And so that's sort of the next thing that, I sort of took this natural evolution through my book. And that was sort of, and with me, it happened very naturally because my brother had died and I started to receive these things would happen to me that I felt were him communicating with me. And I started to look into after death communications, and they're also very, very common. I mean, just like the end of life experiences, so many people, or Laura Lynn Jackson calls them signs. She wrote a whole book about them. Signs or messages or events that you have where you feel that this is your loved one connecting with you, and they're very subjective, so they're not something you could ever prove. They usually just involve one person, and so they're not really, you can't really study them scientifically except to look at the numbers of people that have them and how they describe them, and kind of try to group them in different types of things that people have. And sometimes there are experiences like that involve more than one person, or that can be quite evidential, but they're just so meaningful when they happen. And they're so personal and direct without having a medium there, that they're wonderful to have. And as I said, they're just really common. So it might be something like a smell, like the one I described in my book, that Lloyd Auerbach had, which was amazing, where his friend who he lost had smoked a very specific type of cigar, and he was driving in his car at, some while after his friend had died, and he suddenly, that cigar smoke filled his car, that smell. And it turned out, when he got to where he was going, he called another friend who was very close to the person who had died and described that experience. And that other friend said, the exact same thing just happened to me. And it was at the same time that it had happened to Lloyd in the car. Two other friends of his had the same cigar smoke at the same time as he did, and they were also very close to the guy who died. I mean, that was pretty amazing. It doesn't usually happen like that.
Wow.
But that's one that's really, really evidential, because it was 3 times in the same moment, more or less. So, be more normal for it just to be one person, and you have that smell, and you absolutely know, my God, and you can feel that they're there. Now you can go, and then you get out of your car and you can go tell your friend that happened, but your friend's going to go, that's cool. They're not going to have any way of comprehending the meaning that has for you.
Yeah, for sure.
But for you, the experiencer, that can be the most evident. For someone like me who has studied all these things, those kinds of experiences will be more evidential to me personally than anything I could ever read or study or learn about that didn't happen to me directly. Even though when you tell someone else about them, they're not going to be as important as other types of things that my book deals with, like reincarnation or something. So that just shows the meaning is something that's only, we create for ourselves, and it's personal. And we know, we have experiences, and those are the ones that I think really affect us most deeply, even if we can't prove them to anybody else.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, we receive them, we experience them, we derive meaning from them. I think that's the important part.
And then everybody will have their own aspect of, if you're on a search to try to understand consciousness or survival, everybody will have their own particular thing that will be most convincing to them, and it's going to be different for every person.
For sure.
Whether it be something in the research, or whether it be something that happens to them, or whatever. It's very, very individual and very personal. That's why you can't ever really say something proves it. I mean, there are things that are highly, highly, highly suggestive, just intellectually, but a lot of it for a person is what meaning they get from it, and what experiences they've had, and what feels real to them.
Absolutely.
So.
Well, and this naturally goes into the world of the realm of ghosts and spirits and manifestations. What are the different types of ghosts that you encountered in your researching of all this?
Yeah, in my researching, I thought you were going to say that you encountered not too
I
many
wanted to,
ghosts.
yeah. That's why I added those last few words in there.
I'm glad you did that. I would go, no, I won't. But anyway, well, I mean, Lloyd Auerbach is an expert on the study of apparitions. He's been doing it for decades. So he actually wrote. I invited him to again to write the chapter because I feel like why wouldn't readers just get it from the horse's mouth rather
Yeah,
than have
sure.
me paraphrase them? So he wrote this fantastic chapter about apparitions. And there he makes the distinction between hauntings and apparitions. Really, hauntings are things where you might see the same thing over, like if a ghost that you might see over and over again doing the same thing in the same place. It's almost like a video loop that sort of repeats itself, and it's
Yeah.
almost like something trapped in time, some kind of energy thing that's trapped.
And it's usually non-interactive too, right?
Non-interactive, exactly. It's almost like watching a movie or something. And that's more like a haunting. And what you mentioned about interactive, that is what really makes something evidential of survival. So when you move on from hauntings to apparitions, the key element is that they be interactive. And when you have an apparition that's interactive, and that means that it's like responding to human beings who are around it in its environment. You can make the pretty strong argument that there's intelligence there, there's consciousness there. And so in this one case that Lloyd studied extensively, the apparition, who was seen by many people in this house, and they all saw her in the same way, and she would wave to them and stuff. She developed a connection to this 11-year-old boy who was a member of that household and actually was able to telepathically communicate to that child all this information about her life when she was alive. And then years later, they were able to find a relative of hers. They had no way, I mean, it was not easy. They didn't know anybody in her family. They knew nothing about this woman. And years later, they were able to find a cousin of hers or something. And it turned out that the information she had provided that child was accurate to the life of this woman and she had died in the house. So that almost is similar to the child being a medium. He was able to actually get messages from this deceased person. But the interesting element, of course, was that it was this entity was visible. This was an apparition and those cases they're unusual. There aren't that many cases where you get these communications, but you do have cases where multiple witnesses see an apparition that's interactive. I mean, that's really the most evidential you're going to get with apparitions is, you need multiple witnesses, and you need, that's the most important thing, and some kind of responsiveness on the part of the apparition.
Did everybody in the house see the spirit of the woman, or was it just the boy in this case?
Everybody saw. I think it was just 3 people, though. It was the
Okay.
2 parents and the boy. And what happened was they were all seeing her, and they didn't tell the other person because they didn't want to scare them, and they just didn't talk about it with each other. And then when finally one of them brought it up, it turned out that all of them had been seeing her without
Wow.
telling each other, which was very evidential. And they saw her wearing the same clothes and stuff, and they saw her in the same places. Yeah, so it was 3 people. But the child was the only one who seemed to develop this intense bond with her, and to the level that he was communicating with her like this. He was actually like, friends with her in a certain sense. It was kind of strange.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of all of this, what do we know about poltergeist activity?
Yeah, poltergeists are really fascinating, but they're generally poltergeists are like when you have a lot of physical kind of psychokinetic events happening in a household, and it's usually, in most cases, it's believed to be caused by the emotional turmoil of somebody in that household. Often it's a troubled adolescent maybe going through puberty or a little older than that. And they, where things will fly around the room, and fires will start spontaneously, or things will break. They're not pleasant. Poltergeists are not a positive thing for most people. So it's just sort of like these physical phenomena happening. But it's usually, the emotional turmoil of the person somehow creates that, and nobody understands how that happens. But they know that when that person leaves the house, or something changes with that individual, then the phenomena stops. So that's sort of how they've been able to study it and figure that out. But there are some cases where there seems to be some kind of intelligence there. And Ian Stevenson, who studied these, also raised the question of whether those could have some kind of spirit element to them, or there could be some kind of entity behind them. But they're not really strong evidence for survival past death, because most cases they're not dead spirits that are doing these things. But it also shows the reality of psychokinesis, that this is really something that really happens.
It's almost like misdirected, or somebody who's not connected to the fact that they can do that, just sort of subconsciously doing it.
Exactly. And not even knowing they're doing it. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that can happen. That and then there sometimes things things you see in the movies, drawers opening and closing. I think most people think these things don't really happen, but they do. They definitely do. They've been well documented, and there are books about them and papers on them, and really, really interesting stuff.
There's even something called a domesticated poltergeist, which I was not clued in on until I read it in this book. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was sort of a jokey kind of phrase that was used, but there have been some situations where people. Well, this was what you're talking about specifically was the Philip experiments.
Yes.
Yeah, which were done by this Canadian group, I believe in the 70s. Again, I may be getting some of my time frames wrong. 70s, 80s maybe. Where this group got together and they created a fictitious being. So his name was Philip, and they gave him a whole life. He lived, a couple hundred years ago in England, and he had all these things happen to him. They created this person with a history and a story to his life and all the details of his life, and they focused on this being, and they created. So to him, he became sort of, to their minds, he sort of was like, it was like having a spirit but they created it. So he was like this dead person so then they went into what we call a seance room, a room, with a table in it, and they tried to get this Philip to communicate with them. And they were able to do that, so that the Philip entity would communicate with them by making a knocking on a table or moving a table a certain number of times for yes, a certain number of times for no. And they could ask him all these questions, and he would reply, but only he could only reply to questions that they had given him the information to be able to answer.
Yes.
In their creation of him. So if you ask him something that they hadn't created for him, he couldn't answer it. So it was just, and then I think it developed so he could do more and more things. He might have, it developed over time that Philip could maybe levitate a table or whatever. But what was interesting was that this was a human created spirit and it eventually, now I'm just remembering it, that he seemed to have sort of develop his own personality over time, that he seemed to have likes and dislikes and moods, and almost like he did have a personality that was somewhat independent of what they had created for him over time, Yeah.
Wow.
But it just shows that it again points to the argument that people make that a lot of phenomena happen through human agency alone. You don't have to have a dead person to create a lot of the phenomena that people attribute to dead people.
Sure.
And that things like moving objects around a room, these experiments, the Philip experiment being one of them, and there was some other experiments as well, showed that just through concentration and intention, human beings can create a lot of paranormal phenomena without having to say or that they're dead people, or without even, asking dead people to do it. So, of course, that have nothing to do with survival past death. It's just sort of interesting, that it happens. But, there's some of the more extreme examples I think human beings couldn't create on their own. But we don't know that. We don't know how far it would go if they spent years and years and years and years with this Philip character. We don't know how far it might have evolved. But then you don't know if other energies might have been coming in as well from the outside. You just never know what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very compelling area of study, and it could be all that dynamic could be a symptom of how disconnected we are with the potentials of the things that we can do with our minds. Like
Right.
we live in a very right now, particularly very atheistic, almost fundamentally so, scientific, materialist based society. So, for most people, that stuff isn't even on the menu. They're not even thinking about the potentials of any of that, much less that they could have an active part in it. So, yeah, it's
Yeah,
interesting to see, that how much the brain could do that we don't even give it a chance to do.
exactly. Or
Yeah.
you might want to say the mind instead of the
Yeah,
brain,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
whatever.
That's
Yeah,
yes.
exactly right. And there's a lot, if you really focus and concentrate and have strong intention and you unite with other people in that,
Yeah,
there's a lot that you can do.
absolutely. And that
Yeah,
could have great positive potentials if we only just pointed our minds in that direction.
that's a good point. That's a
Yeah,
very good point.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yep.
Okay, on to the last area that I want to cover, and I want to thank you for being so generous with your time.
Oh,
This is
I'm
such
enjoying it.
these are such fascinating subjects. Like I could talk for hours about them, and you've done all this great research and wrote a great book about it. So I
Thank
want to
you.
pick your brain.
That's
Um,
fine. I'm enjoying it.
um, what are this kind of gracefully goes into the area of physical mediumship, which I've been fascinated with ever since I read about it first in junior high school.
Mm.
Tell us about maybe a brief encapsulation of what physical mediumship is and some of your experiences that you've had with it.
Yeah, I mean it's I like you find I'm very fascinated by physical mediumship. Of all the topics I covered in my book, that's the one that I'm most fascinated by. But that also may be partly because I've had experiences with it. But what it is it's a medium, so it's very different from mental mediumship. Physical medium almost always goes into a trance state, first of all. They're in a room with a group of people. It's usually in the dark, but not always. And it's usually the same people. They develop a kind of a bonded relationship with a group of people, which they call their home circle. Usually, I mean, this is the best way to do physical mediumship is when you have a home circle that meets every week for a long period of time, and that's how you develop yourself as a physical medium. And what happens is the medium goes into a trance state in which he or she, let's just say he, because the one I work with is a he, um, it basically leaves his body. This is how he perceives what's going on. He's left his body, and the spirit team that he works with will use his body to communicate with the sitters. And so the spirit team will actually speak through his vocal cords. And so he'll be talking, but you'll hear their voices, but they'll be using his body to do it. He's gone. And then the spirit team, what the reason it's called physical mediumship is that these spirit beings are able to create a lot of physical phenomena in the room that are things that are never supposed to be able to happen, but they do. They do happen. And there's a lot of things like levitations of objects, creation of lights in the room out of nothing, sounds. There are also voices that can speak not through the medium, but can speak just independently in different parts of the room. You can hear a voice coming from somewhere. Um, all kinds of, bells ringing and just a lot of impact on physical objects, and voices. And then the most incredible part of it is the materialization of living forms, whether it be hands or even whole living forms of people, where the dead people actually use the substance called ectoplasm. And I know this sounds completely insane to people, but I have to tell you that it has been well documented through the last 150 years that this actually happens. Where so these spirit energies can manipulate this substance, which comes out of the body of the medium, which is called ectoplasm, and that was named that by a very famous French scientist. It's not just something from Ghostbuster movies, it was really a term that was chosen carefully back 100 years ago or so. And they can form beings from this ectoplasm, or they can create a living hand, or they can use it to attach a rod to something in the room and move it around. So those are some of the things that happen. I mean, different mediums specialize. There might have different things happening more than others. But there have been scientists that have, taken these mediums into completely controlled conditions where it was absolutely impossible for them to have any fraud going on, and have been able to document that these things happen. And sometimes there's lights and they're able to see them, and these are all written down, and there's Nobel Prize winning scientists, and scientists with incredible reputations who have risked their reputations to study a medium and have written a 90-page report on what they saw and what they observed. And these things are out there in the world. And I think when I was writing my book, it was just the most incredible thing for me was to discover the history of research that's gone on with physical mediumship, how absolutely rigorous it has been. But I have to make the point that there were plenty of frauds, plenty of them. And most people think all physical mediums were or are frauds, but that isn't the case. But certainly there were a lot of them. And in fact, many of these very, very astute investigators would study a particular medium with the intention of proving them to be frauds. I mean, that was their goal. Oh, we're going to show you that she's a fraud. And then they would eliminate all possibilities of by their strict controls that there could have been any fraud. And then they document the fact that, in fact, these things happened, that they were real. And so we have, there are quite a few physical mediums over the years that have been documented at that level, and there are books about them. And if people are interested, they can go to my Facebook page. I'd be happy to make recommendations or whatever. And I make references to some of them in my book, but there's quite a few, but there aren't that many because this is not a common ability that people have. But in the earlier days of, in the early part of this of the 1900s, late 1800s, right through the 1920s and 30s, 40s, there were quite a few, really outstanding physical mediums. And there were many situations in which people could see these things in the light, and they could touch these forms, and they were completely well documented. So I find this to be so astonishing and so hard to believe. And I'm sure that I respect anybody who's finds that they just can't accept that this could happen. It's totally understandable to me that they would feel that way, and I would just encourage them to read some of the studies that I referenced in my book if they're curious about it. And I think the final phase for me was to actually find a medium who's alive now that I was able to actually experience this with myself, which was it was at the very end of my book, because this was sort of like the epitome of, the most important moment for me of all the work I'd done. And it's so hard to describe to anybody else, and it's so hard to convince people that it even happens, that I saved it for the very end of the book. So I'm thinking that maybe by the time they got there, they'd be able to understand it just a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I also talk about some of the studies that came before, such as the Kluski hands that were, this Polish medium in which these scientists were able to create molds made from spirit hands that manifested in his room.
With the hot wax?
Yeah. I mean, that to me was so profound. I got the original book with all the photographs, and I would stare at them, and absolutely meticulous documentation for every single one of them that was made, how they did it, the measurements of how much wax they used, and blah, all the things that were done to control the experiments were all written down. And
wow.
These were actually, just so that people know what we're talking about, these spirit hands would manifest in the room, and the investigators asked them to dip themselves in hot wax, which was in the room. So the spirit hands would go into the hot wax, and the people in the room could hear the wax being, they hear the wax moving around. They would sometimes feel splashes of it coming on their bodies. Sometimes they would see little sparkling lights. Sometimes they'd see the hands. And the hands would then, when the wax dried, the hands would dematerialize, and there'd be this glove that would drop onto a table or onto the body, onto the laps of the sitters or whatever. And the gloves was so thin that they were like a piece of paper or even thinner, that there was no way a hand could ever extract itself from this glove other than to dematerialize. If they tried to pull themselves out of it, the whole thing would break.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
and sometimes the hands were interlocked. It would be two hands, for instance, that were interlocked. The fingers were entwined or something. So there's absolutely no way that a human being could have created it under the controlled conditions that they had in that room. And so then they would take these gloves and pour plaster in them and then peel the wax away, and they'd have a perfect model of what these spirit hands. It's like a record of an actual materialization, and I found that to be so powerful.
Yeah.
And one little point about them that's really interesting is that some of the hands, although they looked like adult hands, they had all the features of an adult hand, they were actually child size. So they were too small to have been an adult human hand, which in some ways makes them even more evidential, that they're almost like a small, they were too small. And of course, there were no children in the room or anything. They controlled it to make sure that nobody brought anything into the room. The investigators would sometimes put dye in the wax, but not tell anyone, the medium or any of the sitters, that there was dye in the wax, so that the mold could be related to that particular bowl of wax. They were very, very rigorous about it. And they, of course, controlled the medium by holding his legs and his arms. And he was completely unconscious in trance when all this is going on, but they were holding his body, so they knew he wasn't doing anything. So anyway, it was, and I had the privilege of going to Paris last fall and actually seeing the 4 of the molds that are in an institute there that are kept in a locked vault in the dark.
Wow.
Because they're so precious. But I was fortunate enough to be able to see them and touch them and everything, and it was really meaningful to me. So this is an example of, just so that people know, that those experiments took place in the 1920s. So we're talking 100 years ago, but these scientists were as rigorous as you could ever want. Just because it took place in the past doesn't mean it's not valid today. And, when people look at these studies, and there's other studies as well in different mediums, you get the idea that these things actually did happen. So then, when I describe my current experiences, I was hoping it might make it a little more easy for people to get the fact that this can really happen, and therefore, if it could happen then, why not now? And the point is that there is this medium in England. His name is Stuart Alexander. And I've been sitting with him and studying him for about 5 years now. I first sat with him in spring of 2014, I believe it was, and sat with him many, many times and gotten to know him very well. And I wrote about my first 2 sittings with him, I wrote about in my book, and then I invited him to write the last chapter in my book himself. So you get to hear from him directly about how he developed as a medium, what it's like for him to do this, why he does it, what it means, all these things, and kind of gave him the final word in the book. But it's quite phenomenal to experience these physical events that it's like witnessing something that's impossible over and over again.
And you said that it gave you a feeling of euphoria, right?
Well, I have to admit, although it doesn't sound very journalistic, but certainly the first time, what you do as a journalist, I feel like one of my contributions here is that I'm able to be both an experiencer and a journalist. And a lot of people I don't think could do both. But I have that ability. I can wear both hats. And so when I go into that seance room, I'm in there as an experiencer. And when I come out, I have an audio recording, and I reflect on it, and I analyze it, and I think about it. But so when I was in that room, the first time that I experienced the levitating trumpet, I think that's what you're talking about, it really was like, and other things too, but it is quite euphoric when you see something that is just so incredible that you can't ever imagine it could ever happen, that you see, because there's this object in the room called a trumpet. It's like a little megaphone. And it's lit up. So even though we're sitting in the dark, you can see the trumpet rise up off the ground. It flies around the room. It goes up to the ceiling and bangs on the ceiling. It goes over in the corner. Then it comes around and it strokes people's faces. And again, this is in the pitch dark. So if it was a human being doing it, which I know it isn't, they couldn't meticulously, like this one time it went right around my face but didn't touch my glasses. So this thing gently touched my cheeks, right under my glasses, up above my glasses. Sometimes they'll tap you on your shoulder. Sometimes the trumpet will just suspend itself in front of you and you'll actually hear a voice coming out of it. That's really, so just something about that trumpet flying around the room. It's like this exuberant, awesome thing to witness, and everybody in the room is so happy. You feel like you're just, it's something incredibly joyful about it, to just the energy that happens when the thing moves around and flies, and just the pure joy of witnessing something that is so unexplainable and so miraculous. And after a while, I've witnessed that so many times, as have countless other people who have sat with Stuart. He's been doing this for about 40 years now. Countless people have witnessed the trumpet. It even becomes sort of less spectacular after a while when I hate to say it. It's wonderful every time, but after a while, it's like, it's very easy. It's one of the easier things for the spirit people to do. There are other things that are more difficult. But anyway, it is very euphoric, especially at the beginning when you first experience it. At least it was for me.
Speaking of the difficulty for the spirits, that you do mention that it's a lot of work. They say that it's a lot of work to manifest this stuff for people.
They do. They've and again, we're all going to accept. Maybe not everybody would accept that these really are spirits, but I'm going to accept that for this moment because that's how it's discussed by the medium. That the spirit, whose name is Walter, who's the one responsible for the physical manifestations, has described that it took years and years to develop these abilities. And some mediums in the past, the ones we were talking about earlier that you can read about, might have taken them a lot less time. It just depends. Every medium is different. But Stuart Alexander is one that developed slowly and methodically, year after year after year, incredible patience. And one of the things that Walter does is he actually manifests his physical living hand. And that experiment took many years to develop. As I wasn't around then, but as I've been told, it took many, many years it wasn't just an easy thing to do at all. Now he can do it fairly easily. But that's an experiment where you can actually see. A lot of the stuff is done in the dark because ectoplasm is very sensitive to light. But the experiment they do with the hand, when they materialize his hand, it's done in the light, and you can actually see it as well as touch it. And I've had that experience many times as well. As have other people. So that's phenomenal when you to touch this, to watch it form out of ectoplasm. And then touch it.
Is it at this point? Is it self-contained, or is it still connected to the medium somehow?
It's connected. That's a good question. What happens is the ectoplasm comes out of the body of the medium. So I think for the hand experiment, it comes out of Stuart's abdomen. Lots of times ectoplasm comes out of the medium's mouth, and there are photographs that show that it kind of looks like cheesecloth or something. So people say, "Oh, that's just fake," It does look weird in a photograph. It's easy to look at it and say, "Oh, come on, that's fake." But it's a moving, living substance. So when you take a snapshot of it, it's going to look weird. But so often it comes out of the mouth or the ears. But I think, and then it can come out of the abdomen, like the belly button area or something. And I think for the hand thing, that's where it comes out of. I know for the trumpets that Stuart does, when the trumpets levitate, what's happening is there's an ectoplasm. Ectoplasm is being used as a rod to attach to the trumpets and move them around the room. So that I know that ectoplasm comes from his abdomen. Sometimes he wakes up while this is happening, and he says it feels very uncomfortable, and he can feel it in his abdomen. But so with the hand, what happens is you're sitting opposite Stuart, and the table is between you and Stuart, and the table is lit up. And you can see the cloud of ectoplasm coming from him over the top of the table. So it's definitely still connected to his body. It doesn't function independently of the medium. It's always connected to the medium. And that's why you have to be so careful with ectoplasm not to do something harsh, like suddenly put a light on or grab it or something, because then it goes back into the medium's body and it can be very harmful. because it is always connected. So yeah, you see it coming over the table, but at the other end, it's connected to his body somehow. Although I can't see that part because it's dark between him and the table. It's dark because it's just too sensitive for them to put the light on. So yeah, and it just looks like this cloud over the table, and then you see this hand, you see these digits kind of form. I've got drawings in my book that sort of show the progression. These digits form, and then it suddenly becomes three-dimensional, and it bangs on the table, and it's three-dimensional, and then you're able to touch it. And it feels just like a regular living hand, It's really phenomenal. And Walter, the spirit guide, whose hand it is talking to you throughout the whole experiment. So when it's okay to touch it, and when where to put your hand on the table, and it's all directed so that it's all done safely, because they have to be very careful to protect the safety of the medium through. It's a very, very sensitive business. You got to be really careful. So they direct you how to do it, but many, many people have had that experience. And Stuart has sat in so many different locations under so many different circumstances that if he was committing fraud, he would have been found out by now. And I can tell you that I checked that room, and I checked everything about his mediumship thoroughly when I first started sitting with him. And there's just no way. There's absolutely nothing funny going on there at all. It's absolutely genuine what's going on with him.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
I hope to experience it sometime myself.
I know. Well, it's horrible now with this with the virus.
Yes.
That there's been no sitting for quite a while.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And I've been joining their sittings through my computer, actually. For about the last 2 years. They sit every Monday, and I've sort of become part of the circle, and I connect, although I can't see what's going on in the room, but there's a lot more that goes on beyond just physical. I think Stuart wants everyone to know that what he considers to be the most important part of his mediumship is when people can communicate with their loved ones through his mediumship. That's he thinks the physical stuff is all fine, but it's not really proof of the afterlife. What he feels to be the most evidential is when a sitter can come in and actually talk to their loved one in the seance room. And a lot of what goes on in the readings, in the seances, is that. It's not all, and in fact, when it's just the regular circle meeting and there's no visitors or anybody like that, they often will not do physical things at all. That's because it's just not, they have it down. They don't need to keep doing it over and over,
Yeah.
But they like to experiment with new things and try different things. And a lot of it has to do with also communications between the sitters and people on the other side. That's a big part of it.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. It's very wonderful stuff.
I always wonder how they know consistently who they're getting, or to get the same spirits, as opposed to just some random, maybe malevolent spirit coming along and sort of taking advantage of a situation. That never seems to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly with the seasoned mediums like Stuart, and these team has been working with him for decades, and one came first, and then another one came, and they're extremely consistent. They've been the same voice, the same personalities. You feel like you know them as people. They're very distinctive, and yeah, I think they would probably protect him from anything like that happening, because they're just around, and they start drawing close to him every Monday before the sitting even starts. He can feel them. Sometimes the sitters, the circle members can feel them around. And so I'm sure they would have a way of protecting him from anything like that happening. I don't know about other situations, but it's never been any malevolent being that has managed to get through with Stuart.
Yeah, I talked to Shannon Taggart, who has done a photography book about seances.
Right.
Yeah, and she's never experienced anything like that. My first episode of The Melt was with Kai, who you also, I believe, associated with. Yeah, he never said anything about anything negative ever coming up. It's just, I think that's amazing that's never happened. That's of course that my paranoid side, thinking that like, well, what if something comes uninvited?
Yeah, well, maybe it does in the earlier years when people are first developing. I think they have to learn. I think mediums have to learn how to protect themselves, and they have to work with spirit people who know how to protect them as well. And I think that's maybe they're more vulnerable in the beginning to that kind of thing happening. And it also might depend on just how developed the person is who is developing themselves as a medium too. What kind of energies they attract. But I've never been in a room where anything like that has happened. I mean, it's not sort of like you're randomly channeling. You're just open and you're kind of randomly channeling whatever happens to come in. You know, you have a very consistent group of spirit people that you work with week after week after week. And when they're really connected to you, that's who's going to come in. And I'm sure they have the capability of keeping the medium safe from anything like that.
Keeping the riffraff out.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, it's interesting because Stuart always starts his seances with the circle leader says a little prayer in the beginning. And one of the things is part of this prayer, he says, is, protect us from any mischievous entities. That's what he says. Keep our medium safe. And so it is referenced at the very beginning, but I don't think it's really anything that anyone worries about.
Cool.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Good to know. Well, to draw all of this to a close, you mentioned before I pressed record about a documentary or a series, a multi-episode documentary that's coming out that's having to do with all this stuff.
Yeah, actually, my book Surviving Death is the basis of, or it's sort of, I guess you'd say it like that, of a 6-part documentary series. It's basically based on the book, but there's a lot of stuff in the series that's not in my book. I mean, it was, some of it is, but a lot of it is different characters that aren't in the book, different cases, but it's based on the book. And I was a participant and a consultant throughout the whole production. So, I had a strong role in playing in the whole thing, but it was a film company in New York City called Breakthrough Films, who I've worked with before. And they were the film company doing it, and it was made for a major streaming network. I'm not allowed to say which one.
Okay.
But if anybody wants to guess the top couple of streaming networks in the world, you can be sure it's on one of those. And they're just not allowing me to say until it's actually officially announced.
Yeah, sure.
But it should be on aired. I mean, the editing is done, and they're doing the final things, post-production things now, and it's supposed to be on in the fall.
Oh, that's great.
So it'll be called Surviving Death.
Cool.
Same title as my book. Yeah.
Fantastic. And you're interviewed throughout it?
I'm interviewed for some of it. There's some episodes where I, like for instance, the episode on child reincarnation cases, we let Jim Tucker be the expert for that episode. They didn't need, if I'm needed, I'm interviewed. But I'm not needed in every single episode, which is fine with me. I have no particular desire to be interviewed, but I certainly had a hand in, determining, helping to produce it.
Nice.
Helping to decide the material and review the content and all that kind of stuff.
Fantastic.
So I think it's going to be helpful, partly because we're in a very dark time right now, and there's a pandemic, and the pandemic may have another wave in the fall, and so it may be a very helpful thing to people because we're dealing with so many dark issues right now.
Absolutely.
People dying of COVID-19 and stuff. So anyway, I hope that it's meaningful to people when it comes out.
Yeah, I definitely look forward to it, and I will be advertising it when it is safe to do so.
Yeah, as long as well, I'll let you know when they finally announce it.
Yeah.
I just don't know when it's going to happen.
Cool.
Yeah.
So do you have any other projects, books, anything in the works?
Well, along these lines, I've worked on another possible documentary series that's sort of related to this, but we don't know if that's going to happen yet. We're just in the planning stages. We might be working on a season 2 for the Surviving Death series. We don't know that yet. And I'm always kind of reading and learning more and more, but I'm also very involved with the UFO issue. And I do write stories for the New York Times with some other reporters, and I've been doing that since our big story. First, we did a very big story in December of 2017, which kind of was a groundbreaking story that kind of changed a lot for the UFO issue. So since then, I've been doing a lot of that as well. So I'm kind of in these two worlds, and I'm also learning more and more about how UFOs and issues of consciousness intersect. And I used to think of them as completely separate. And so one of the interesting things for me to explore now is to see how they might have more similarities than I might have thought. But my reporting on UFOs is very much around just the physicality of them and trying to make people understand that they're real and that the U.S. government studies them and they've been seen by pilots and all those kinds of things. Yeah, so I'm working on these stories for the Times takes up a lot of my time and energy, as well as this other stuff. So.
And that's not, I haven't even dipped my toe into your research into all that, too. I need to read your first book, and perhaps we'll have you back to talk about that, even though that's even an older book than Surviving Death. But it's kind of a timeless issue.
It's older, but I think the book holds up pretty well now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean,
cool.
So if you feel like it, that's fine with me.
Fantastic. So tell our listeners where they can find your work and you online, should they care to.
Yeah, sure. I have a website which has all my UFO stuff and Surviving Death stuff on it. It's called survivingdeathkean.com. That's the website address. My last name is spelled Kean. And I'm also on Facebook. I have an author page. You don't have to be a friend. And I do a lot of discourse, a lot of conversational stuff with people on Facebook. I enjoy that. Although I haven't been on so much lately, but if somebody comes on, I will reply. And sometimes there's more activity than others depending on how busy I am, but you can certainly reach me on Facebook or go to my website, which I have to update. There's a lot of stuff that needs to go up there that's a little bit behind, but anyway, that's how people can find me.
Cool. Well, I'll put those links in the episode notes for sure.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Yes.
It's been great talking with you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this and for, again, being generous with your time. I know we originally talked about a much shorter time, so thanks for letting it go much over that.
I was happy to do it.
There's just so much to cover. An hour seems like we would just be restricted to the headlines of it all, and there's so many cool details and nuances.
I agree with you. I'm glad we were able to. I'm glad you have the time to do it for this long, too.
Absolutely.
I hope
my
it's
pleasure.
Interesting to your listeners.
For sure. I don't know how it couldn't be. And of course, I highly recommend Surviving Death to anybody that's listening. And I will also provide links as to where you can purchase that. Do you have a preferred place that they buy it, or anywhere?
No, not really.
Fine?
I mean, it is on Amazon, and there's a paperback version of it. So it first came out in hardback, and then a year later they put it out in paperback. So it's not expensive if you buy the paperback version.
Fantastic.
And there's also a Kindle version and an audiobook.
Yes, I first read it, hard copy version, and then I listened to the audiobook, which is also very entertaining too. So if any of you are curious about that, that's worth looking into also. Leslie, thank you so much. And perhaps we'll have to do it again, and we'll talk about UFOs next time.
That'd be great, Chris. Thanks so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it. Okay.
All right. Take care, Leslie.
Thank you.
That conversation was a long time coming. I had actually gotten a hold of Leslie Kean via Facebook probably over 2 years ago. And out of the blue, I don't know, a little over a month ago, she just got back to me saying, "I'm so sorry. I don't know why I didn't see your message before." And she was totally up for doing an interview, which is fantastic because I was really impressed with the book, but it had been so long that I had to reread it, in this case, re-listen to it. And it was well worth it. Such an outstanding book and such compelling subject matter. I mean, after reading it, I dare you not to think that something is going on. Something happens after we shed this shell. And I don't know. I'm not saying what it is. I don't think Leslie is either. But it's something. Just so much compelling stuff in this book. So much. I highly recommend it. Whether you're teetering on the edge of whether you think that there's something after our body dies, whether you are assured that there is and you just enjoy listening to these kinds of stories, or maybe you know somebody that recently had a good friend or loved one that has died and needs a little comfort. I mean, I'm not saying this is a sort of a new agey affirmations book or anything like that. There's a lot of evidence in there. There's a lot of stories about different aspects of this subject, and yeah, I don't know. I think that this book it could be very helpful to lots of people. I do hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I know that I did. It was a long time coming and totally worth the wait. And if you do like what you hear, have liked what you have heard, maybe you've listened to some other episodes of The Melt, and you feel compelled to support The Melt, I highly recommend that. I highly encourage it. One of the ways, probably one of the most tangible ways that you can do that is financially. And that can be done at www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast, where you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month up to whatever you think this thing is worth. And every little bit counts. Anything would be greatly appreciated. I want to keep expanding this podcast, making it better, upgrading the equipment, having more time to do more episodes. Although this last month has been a very, very busy month, then yes, contributions would help greatly. And if you can't afford financial contributions, there's other ways to do it too. You can share or link to episodes or the podcast wherever you hang out online. You can recommend it to friends or family. Or you can, wherever you subscribe to The Melt, whether that be iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, so on and so forth, you can leave a good review or a high rating. Any of those things would help, and they're all greatly appreciated. As I appreciate you. Thank you so much for listening, for getting this far, especially. And again, I hope that you were able to get something from this and it gave you food for thought. Until 2 weeks from now, please take care of yourselves.